There's two pretty famous quotes by game designer Soren Johnson. Given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun out of a game. And one of the responsibilities of a designer is to protect players from themselves. And I think this is generally true for most games. If a player is able to find an optimal way of doing something, they almost always will, even if that optimal solution isn't very fun. Today, I'd like to go through a couple of different games and look at how different designers approach this problem of protecting players from optimizing the fun out of their games. First, let's take a look at competitive games. Competitive games are one of the genres where designers have to be most cognizant of this, since in these types of games, players are most incentivized to play optimally and take as little risk as humanly possible. Ideally, a competitive game will provide players with multiple viable strategies. That way, players are able to use what they find most appealing without putting themselves at a significant disadvantage. However, that doesn't always happen. Many games have their competitive scenes kneecapped due to an overpowered or unfun strategy being so efficient that players were essentially forced to play them in order to stay competitive. This can be easily seen in fighting games. If a playable character is too strong, they have the possibility to absolutely dominate their game's metagame to a problematic level. In both JoJo's Heritage for the Future and Super Smash Bros. Brawl, there were incredibly overtuned characters with Pet Shop and Meta Knight. These guys were just better than the rest of their rosters thanks to how many options their respective kits provided. Or you have characters like Hild from Soul Calibur 4, who didn't necessarily have as many options as Pet Shop or Meta Knight, but had a very easy and consistent ring out combo, meaning that if she got the right hit, she could essentially instantly win the game off of just one move. These characters were so good that in order to prevent their games from turning into nothing but mirror matches, their communities had to take action. Both Pet Shop and Hild, and occasionally Meta Knight depending on the tournament series, were banned from competitive play. While removing these characters from the game helps their competitive scene, it does unfortunately hurt players who just enjoy playing those characters. Luckily, in more modern games, developers have the ability to fix problematic characters thanks to patching. Tekken 7, Killer Instinct, and Street Fighter 4 all had problematic characters like Leroy Fulgore and Sagat that were very powerful when they were first added, but thanks to a bunch of nerfs to their respective kits, they became a lot less oppressive. Obviously, this problem isn't exclusive to fighting games. Plenty of other competitive games have stopped players from locking in on optimal strategies thanks to important patches. In CSGO, they nerfed the insanely overpowered revolver shortly after it was added. Team Fortress 2 had a short stint where the Flog was the most powerful weapon in the game, and Demon Hunter absolutely dominated Hearthstone's metagame when it was first added. The solution for modern games is pretty straightforward. If something is overpowered, you can just adjust a few numbers to make them a bit weaker. That way they're no longer the optimal choice. But what if your game is physical? Enter Magic the Gathering. Magic the Gathering, unlike digital card games like Hearthstone, doesn't have the ability to rebalance cards after they're released, since they're physically released in paper, and Wizards of the Coast can't really go to every game store and change all the cards manually. So if a strategy or card is too strong, there are a few ways that the designers can handle it. For example, let's take a card like Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. This card used to be incredibly powerful to the point where almost every competitive modern deck was using it. One way Wizards handles problematic cards like this is by printing more cards that can be used to answer it. So enter the card Orcish Bowmaster. This has the ability to easily ping down Ragavan before it gets out of control. That being said, Orcish Bowmasters is arguably the new Ragavan, but I digress. With the existence of Bowmasters, Ragavan is still good, but not nearly as dominant as it used to be. But solutions like this don't always work. Metagames usually move a lot faster than Wizards can print physical cards, so sometimes they have to take a more drastic approach by full-on banning cards from competitive play. Usually cards get banned for just generally being overpowered. Cards like Hogak, Oko Thief of Crowns, and Luris of the Dream Den were so utterly dominant when they released that they needed to be banned in order to allow for other decks to survive in their respective metagames. But what I think is a little bit more interesting is cards that they ban due to unfun play patterns. Sensei's Divining Top is a card that's good, but not insanely good. The main purpose of the card is to collect information about your upcoming draws, which can be kind of a problem in tournaments. While this card was legal, it was constantly causing competitive games to go to time. Players were spending so much time analyzing their next possible move with the extra information this card provided that most of the time they weren't even able to finish their games. So eventually, Wizards of the Coast had to step in and remove it from competitive play with a ban. Sometimes though, you get both situations, where the play pattern is so unfun and the cards themselves are also decently powerful. The card Grief allows you to force your opponent to discard a specific card when it enters the battle, which is already kind of mean, but players were able to make it even meaner thanks to taking advantage of its evoke cost. When you play a card with its evoke cost, it dies right after it enters. The idea being that you can pay a lesser cost for the card, but you still get the enter the battlefield effect. Savvy players, however, realize that if you combine Grief with effects like Undying Malice or Feign Death and bring it back to the battlefield after you sacrifice it, you can force your opponent to discard another card. And since Grief's evoke cost doesn't actually cost you mana, but instead just costs you a card from your hand, you can do it incredibly quickly. So players quickly developed a deck that would cause their opponents to discard their hand and prevent them from ever getting a solid foothold in the game, while they got to have a bunch of cards like Grief on the battlefield, essentially scamming their opponent out of actually playing the game of Magic, which led to the community nicknaming the deck Rakdos Scam. Eventually, Wizards had to ban the card in their August 2024 Banned and Restricted announcement, and in that same announcement, they banned another very unfun and very powerful card by the name of Nadu Winged Wisdom. Nadu provides a passive ability to itself and all of your creatures that says whenever this creature is targeted by an ability, you get to take the top card of your library and put it into your hand, or if it's a land card, you put it on the battlefield. The problem with this is that this ability works very well with equipment cards like Shuko that allows you to target all of your creatures for 0 mana. So you could repeatedly target all of your creatures, triggering Nado's ability over and over again. Then you would also combine it with effects like Springheart and Tuku that made a creature whenever a land enters. So you could essentially engine through your deck where you're constantly making creatures that you can target, and eventually you would play the card Thassa's Oracle, which lets you win the game once your deck has no more cards in it. This was a very strong deck, but it's also absolutely miserable to play against for two major reasons. The first being that this combo isn't actually deterministic, meaning that the Nadu player has the ability to kind of just flub the combo if they don't draw the right cards. So players playing against Nadu will have to sit through the Nadu player's turn, hoping that they would eventually fizzle the combo, which is very time consuming and also very boring since you couldn't really do much to stop it. This was also made even worse due to how annoying it is to track. You may not have noticed when I first said it, but Nadu's ability only triggers twice per creature, which is weird because usually this is once. So players ended up having to use this awkward sheet of paper to track the number of times that they've actually triggered Nadu's ability on each creature. It was super janky and looked really weird when you watched tournament coverage. And needless to say, this card had to be banned due to how many problems it caused. That being said, while banning cards like Nadu is generally good for the game, banning cards isn't exactly a good solution for a card game like Magic. Since Magic's physical, you have to actually buy these individual cards, and they can get expensive. So players can spend hundreds and sometimes even thousands of dollars designing and building these decks. So when you ban a card that is essential to a deck strategy, like Nadu, players who have financially invested in this deck get completely screwed over by a ban, which doesn't exactly inspire consumer confidence. That being said, the central game of Magic isn't changed. The same can't be said for when an optimal strategy dominated a game like Overwatch. When it launched, one of the central aspects of Overwatch was the flexibility of your team composition. Thanks to a massive roster of different playable heroes, you were incentivized to try out different combinations of characters to figure out which worked best together. Initially, players found that the most consistent competitive strategy would be to use 2 characters from each of the in-game classes: tank, damage, and support. However, this all changed with the introduction of the hero Brigitte, a character that was labeled as a support but was designed to be a pseudo-mesh of the tank and support roles. On launch, this character was very strong. She was very good at keeping herself alive thanks to her big shield, and she was also great at outputting a ton of healing. Plus, she could do a decent amount of damage thanks to her powerful stuns, making her an absolute menace to play against. While most of the community instantly clocked this character was overtuned, one competitive team took it a step further. In the 2018 North American Open Divisions event, a team by the name of Goats revealed an innovative strategy that they had developed. Instead of going with the traditional 2-2-2 setup that almost every other team ran, they instead ran a team with no damage characters in all, instead using 3 tanks and 3 support. This strategy turned out to be the secret combination that broke Overwatch. Running the Goats composition essentially made your team unkillable, thanks to the amount of sustain it was able to provide. Soon, every competitive match turned into nothing but Goats mirrors. Since if you weren't running some variation of this composition, you were essentially putting your team at a massive disadvantage. And this was pretty bad. It completely screwed over a ton of competitive players who specialized in the damage category and made games absolute sucks to both play and watch. This was a very obvious problem, and Blizzard quickly tried to fix it. First, they tried the typical method of heavily nerfing Brigitte multiple times, but nothing seemed to work, and they instead resorted to the nuclear option. With a new update, they added a restriction to team formation. Now every team was required to use 2 tanks, 2 damage, and 2 healers. Players had optimized team composition so much that Blizzard had to step in and change the rules of the game in order to make sure it at least was a little bit fun to play again. But with this change, it fundamentally changed Overwatch itself, and arguably for the worse. While the Goats problem was solved, forcing this new rule set meant players lost the ability to experiment with creative team compositions. Additionally, this update also came with the introduction of role queue, which caused queue times to skyrocket, especially for those playing the damage role, which was pretty horrible. Now players were waiting just ages to get into a game. Overwatch, in my opinion, is a prime example of a developer fixing the optimization problem in the wrong way, since their fix came at the expense of a lot of the game's fun. So far, I've only been talking about competitive games, where I think the optimization problem is very straightforward. A strategy or a character is too strong, so developers will do their best to rein it in, usually by patches, and sometimes communities will step in when the developer isn't able to. So let's instead move to the complete other end of the gaming spectrum and take a look at single-player RPGs. Most RPGs have a standard leveling system where every time you kill an enemy, you will usually receive experience points. Then once you receive enough experience points, you will level up, with certain moves or skills usually being locked behind a specific level. Hypothetically, you could do something called grinding, where you continuously kill low-level enemies over and over again to get experience points without the challenge that comes with fighting enemies closer to your level. But games usually try to prevent this practice by scaling XP needed to reach each level. So for instance, it might take 10 XP to get from level 1 to 2, but 1000 to get from 10 to 11. However, some games take an additional step to prevent players from grinding. In the original Persona 3, there were 2 big anti-grinding mechanics. If you're not aware of how the Persona series works, it's essentially a mix between RPG, social simulator, and time management games. What this means is that the game limits you on what you can do each in-game day. So you have to choose between hanging out with people to strengthen your social links with them, work on your non-combat skills by doing things like studying to increase your academics, or doing karaoke to increase your courage. Or you can focus on the RPG aspect of the game. In Persona 3, you explore Tartarus, this massive tower of randomly generated floors, with different sections of the tower unlocking after you beat one of the full moon bosses, which would appear at the end of each in-game month. The idea being that you would have an entire in-game month to explore a section of Tartarus, which in turn should give you enough experience to be ready to fight the full moon boss. On paper, you could just sit on a random floor in Tartarus and grind the same enemies over and over again, but in order to keep you moving from floor to floor, Atlas added something called the Reaper. The Reaper is this roaming super boss that will eventually spawn once you've been on a floor for too long. This thing is dangerously strong and will likely wipe out your team if you end up facing it. This is a great incentive to keep you moving through Tartarus quickly, rather than methodically farming the enemies within it. Along with the Reaper, Persona 3 also added the tiredness mechanic. After your character or one of your party members has fought in a certain number of battles, they will enter the tired status. While tired, they are more likely to miss their attacks and will take more damage, making tired characters essentially just walking liabilities in combat. Additionally, if you go back to the base of Tartarus to refill your health and stamina, tired party members will straight up leave your party and won't be willing to go back to Tartarus for a couple of in-game days. I think there were two major reasons why the developers introduced this mechanic. The most obvious being to prevent you from spending every day of the month grinding away at Tartarus when you should be working on your social links or social stats. Another reason is to force you to use a variety of party members. In a few of the game's full moon bosses, you won't actually have access to all of your party members due to a variety of story reasons, so you can get kinda screwed over in certain boss battles if you're missing your team's most important party member. By setting up this expectation that you won't always have access to all of your party members in the Tartarus section, it forces you to learn to be flexible with your team composition and make losing a character in a boss battle significantly less backbreaking. While I understand the thinking behind it, I think the implementation of it has some issues. For starters, hiding the number of battles it takes for a character to get tired makes it feel very random whenever the status actually pops up. And it can feel pretty unfair when the game randomly decides that your healer is now even squishier, or that your highest damage dealer now hits like a wet noodle. It can feel especially bad when the player character gets the tired status. Since you get an instant game over when your player character dies, it makes it so treacherous to navigate through Tartarus, since you could potentially lose hours of progress due to a seemingly random drop of a hat. The frustration this mechanic caused was likely the main reason that it was absent from the remake of Persona 3, Persona 3 Reload, with that game instead changing the resource system to focus on you managing your SP more carefully. Continuing on the anti-grinding mechanics, a game that takes a very unique approach to this problem is Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 2 has an interesting mechanic where enemies will stop respawning after you kill them 15 times. This limits players to a smaller selection of total souls that they can get per area. However, this mechanic could also be seen as a way to help struggling players who are stuck on an area, making it so if they fail so many times, it will eventually become easier over time, which, at least to me, seems quite out of character for the Souls series. Additionally, this mechanic itself incentivizes some pretty bad behavior, because as soon as players realize this mechanic is in the game, it encourages them to slowly kill every enemy over and over again. That way, it makes the lead up to boss battles as easy as possible. Now players aren't encouraged to learn and practice their skills to get through an area. They are instead encouraged to be optimal and completely clear out an area to make the run back as easy as possible. Additionally, Dark Souls 2 doesn't even fully commit to this mechanic either. Once you reach Majula, the home base of Dark Souls 2, you have the ability to join the Covenant Company of Champions. And while you're a part of this covenant, the entire despawning mechanic just gets disabled, meaning players who feel like they need to grind can just join in this covenant and farm as much as they want, and those who don't need to grind can just kill every enemy over and over again and just feel completely safe. Safety is one of those concepts that is sort of tied to optimization. Players will always optimize for safety because they don't want to risk losing any progress. And a great example of this can be seen in Fire Emblem. Fire Emblem is a series known for its fun and difficult strategy gameplay, where players must carefully coordinate their armies through various levels. One of the main sources of that difficulty is due to the presence of permadeath, meaning that if you lose any of your valuable units in combat, they're gone for good. This forces you to be very tactical and very careful about how you move your units, but it also encourages an overemphasis on safety and dirtily gameplay, since you often don't want to risk losing something like your only healer or like a glass cannon mage that you've poured a bunch of resources into. One way to fight against this is by having certain missions have different side objectives or different variation on Fire Emblem's typical level rule set. For instance, some levels there may be villages you have to save within a certain number of turns, or characters you need to recruit in a limited number of turns. Or sometimes levels might just straight up have turn counters preventing you from taking things super slow. These different levels help to get players out of that overly careful box that you can put yourself in. While these are good, the permadeath mechanic still creates a really bad unintended behavior that, in my opinion, is much worse than just making the gameplay a little slower. Since if you lose a character central to your strategy, or it's just a character that you really like, you're not going to accept the fact that they die and move on. No, you need that character. So what you're going to do instead is just restart the level entirely, since there's no other way to get that unit back, which can feel really bad, especially when they died for like a dumb reason, like you accidentally hitting the A button when you weren't supposed to, or, you know, just an enemy getting a lucky like 1% crit for some reason. And this also really sucks because some of these levels are very long and can take over an hour to complete. In Fire Emblem Awakening, they introduced something to stop this. They added a mode selection that you could pick at the beginning of the game. Now you could choose between the classic permadeath mode or a new casual mode that brings back units at the end of each level. The introduction of casual mode was great for newcomers, but the problem is that it takes away a lot of the difficulty that you find in classic mode. While you could be more risky, there's essentially no point in not being risky in casual mode. Ideally, you would need to have some kind of solution that makes permadeath less backbreaking, but not as easy as something like casual mode. Enter Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia. This entry into the series added a brand new mechanic called Milla's Turn Wheel. With this ability, you can now rewind your game actions back a limited number of times. This mechanic allowed players to still enjoy the difficulty of classic mode without the stress of having to reset an hour-long map if they just made one minor mistake. Now, continuing on the RPG path, let's take a look at the ever iconic Dungeons and Dragons. One of the most important parts of D&D is the role-playing aspect. Being able to create and design your own characters that you enjoy role-playing as is a central part of the game, but the creativity of character design can sometimes conflict with the stats-based nature of the game. Each character class has a couple of stats that they want to specialize in. For instance, a bard is primarily going to use the charisma stat, while a barbarian is primarily going to use the strength stat. In universe, this obviously makes sense. A good barbarian is going to be strong, and a good bard is going to be charismatic. However, the problem with this system is during your character creation. In D&D, you can choose from a variety of different fantasy races to play as, which is great for letting players design and craft fun fantasy characters to express themselves as. The issue is that all of these races would get some kind of stat bonus tied to them. So if you wanted to play a certain class, you're more incentivized to pick a race that will give you a stat bonus that will benefit it. So for instance, if you picked to play as a Goliath, you would get a stat bonus to your strength and constitution. But if you decided to play a half-elf, you would get a bonus to your charisma. So if you wanted to create a Goliath bard, it would be statistically worse than playing a half-elf bard. Or if you wanted to play a half-elf barbarian, you would be statistically worse than a Goliath barbarian, even if it didn't really make sense from your character's backstory. So if a player had a fun idea for a more unique and less traditional character, the systems of D&D put them at a statistical disadvantage for expressing themselves in this way. However, recently, Wizards of the Coast fixed this with the release of the 2024 edition of the Player's Handbook, which completely overhauled this system. No longer do players get a stat bonuses from playing a specific race, which also has now been renamed species, which is probably for the best. Instead, they get it from their background. So now when players are constructing their characters and backstories, they won't be limited by what species they're playing as, and instead they can embrace the creativity and expression that role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons provide. Finally, to close this video out, let me talk about the ever-beloved Stardew Valley. In Stardew Valley, your general objective is to build and maintain a profitable farm, since a large variety of the items and upgrades within the game are locked behind price tags, so you're incentivized to make money. Along with this, you're also tasked by Mayor Lewis to complete the town community center. To do this, you have to collect a variety of different items that you have to get from engaging with the different in-game systems. This can range from getting high quality crops, animal products, different fish, and even rare ores. And all these different requirements encourage you to interact with all the game's different systems, except for one, the social mechanic. Pelican Town is home to a wide variety of different residents, and you have the ability to get to know them during your time playing Stardew Valley, with each villager having a meter to track your relationship with them. At first glance, it might not seem like there is much of a reason to engage with villagers at all, but the game does help to push you to interact with them in a couple ways. The first being the energy mechanic. Each day you have a limited amount of energy, and it's pretty easy to use up a lot of energy relatively quickly, especially in the early game when you're going to be doing a lot of things by hand. So often you'll run out of energy before the end of the in-game day, so you'll be pushed to do activities that don't require energy, like talking to villagers. What's also nice is that every time you talk to a villager, it pauses the in-game timer. It allows you to engage and interact with villagers without having to worry about wasting the time in your in-game day. So talking to someone while you walk past them doesn't feel like you're wasting any of your resources. Additionally, the game also locks certain crafting recipes behind certain villagers. So for instance, let's say I am a player who likes fishing. Linus over here has a special bait crafting recipe locked behind the 4th level of his heart meter. Since I want to know how to make this special bait, I'm going to spend time with Linus and build up his heart meter. And then after doing this, I might decide I want to strengthen my relationship with other villagers and potentially unlock more crafting recipes. Additionally, villagers you're close with will also send you extra gifts, which can be a nice small bonus. That being said, if you're wholly focused on building a profitable farm or completing the community center as fast as possible, which are your main objectives, it's far more efficient to kind of just ignore these people. And this is especially true when playing this game in multiplayer. Remember how I mentioned that when you interact with the villagers, it pauses the in-game timer? Well, unfortunately, that doesn't happen in multiplayer. In fact, none of the events that pause the in-game timer in single player happen in multiplayer at all. So you need to be very thoughtful about how you spend your time. So it's generally not worth spending time talking to villagers when you could be farming or mining. And even if you do decide to talk to villagers, you likely won't be absorbing or understanding anything about their character, since the lack of a pause encourages you to kind of just skip past their dialogue instead of actually reading any of it, which feels like kind of a disservice to all these characters. Ideally, these systems would be designed in a way to encourage more of this behavior, and ideally some ways to make it feel less backbreaking in multiplayer. Wrapping this up, no game is going to perfectly solve the optimization problem, but I think it's valuable to look at how different designers approach this problem. Evaluating what elements do and don't work for a game can help the entire industry learn about ways to improve our overall understanding of game design. It helps us better understand the importance of features and design decisions that you might overlook on your first playthrough, and I encourage you to try and spot some of these in your favorite games and see what choices designers make to stop you from playing one dominant strategy and to vary up your gameplay. Anyways, if you would be so kind, I would encourage you to please subscribe to my channel and maybe watch one of my other videos.